The autumn of 1887 painted Elders Hollow in shades of decay that seemed to seep from the very bones of the earth. Clara Ashvale pressed her gloved hand against the cold window of the stagecoach as it wound through the narrow mountain pass, watching familiar landmarks emerge from the perpetual mist like ghosts from her childhood. 20 years had passed since she'd fled this place, yet the twisted oak trees and moss-covered stone walls looked unchanged, as if time itself had forgotten this corner of the world. The driver, a weathered man with nervous eyes, had grown increasingly silent as they approached the town. When Clara mentioned her destination was the Ashvale estate, his knuckles had whitened on the reins, and he'd muttered something about unnatural folk under his breath. She'd chosen to ignore it then, but now, as the familiar iron gates came into view, those words echoed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. The Ashvale mansion loomed against the grey sky like a monument to forgotten sorrows. Its Gothic spires pierced the low-hanging clouds, and the windows stared down at her with the hollow emptiness of a skull's eye sockets. Clara had once called this place home, but now it felt like stepping into a mausoleum. "This is as far as I go, miss," the driver announced, his voice tight with barely concealed fear. "You'll have to walk the rest." Clara gathered her traveling case and stepped down onto the gravel path. The sound of her boots seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As the stagecoach disappeared back into the mist, she found herself truly alone for the first time since beginning her journey from Boston. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing her cousin Marcus, older now, his once golden hair streaked with premature grey, his blue eyes holding depths that hadn't been there in their youth. He wore the same formal black suit she remembered from family gatherings, but it hung differently on his frame, as if he'd grown thinner, more angular. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something else. Apprehension, perhaps. "We weren't certain you'd come." "Grandmother Ashvale deserves a proper farewell," Clara replied, studying his face. "Though I confess, I'm surprised the family reached out to me after all these years." Marcus stepped aside to let her enter, and the familiar scent of old wood and dried herbs enveloped her. The interior of the house was exactly as she remembered. Dark mahogany panels, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and the ever-present smell of something faintly medicinal that she'd never been able to identify. "The others are in the drawing room," Marcus said, leading her through the familiar corridors. "Uncle Silas, Aunt Cordelia, and young Thomas. We've been discussing arrangements." As they walked, Clara noticed details that struck her as odd. Fresh mud on the Persian rugs, despite the dry weather, shovels leaning against the wall near the back entrance, and most unsettling of all, the sound of digging coming from somewhere behind the house. Rhythmic, purposeful, and somehow urgent. The drawing room fell silent as they entered. Uncle Silas, now in his 70s, but still imposing with his silver beard and piercing grey eyes, sat in the high-backed chair that had always been reserved for the family patriarch. Aunt Cordelia, thin and sharp-featured, perched on the edge of the settee like a bird of prey. Thomas, Marcus's younger brother, stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture that reminded Clara painfully of their grandfather. "Clara," Silas said, his voice carrying the authority that had always made her feel small as a child. 20 years is a long time to stay away from family." "I had my reasons," she replied, setting down her case and removing her traveling gloves. "But I'm here now. When is the funeral service?" The family exchanged glances, quick, meaningful looks that spoke of shared secrets. Clara felt the familiar chill of exclusion, the same feeling that had driven her away from Elders Hollow all those years ago. "The burial was this morning," Cordelia said, her voice crisp and matter-of-fact. "Grandmother Ashvale has been laid to rest in the family cemetery." Clara felt a stab of hurt and confusion. "This morning? But the telegram said—" "The telegram was sent after the burial," Silas interrupted. "We needed you here for something else, something more important than a funeral." The sound of digging grew louder, and Clara could no longer ignore it. What's that noise, and why are there shovels by the back door? Thomas shifted uncomfortably by the fireplace. Clara, there are things about our family that you never learned. Things that your father chose to keep from you when he took you away. What kind of things? Marcus moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain, revealing the view of the back garden. In the distance, Clara could see the family cemetery, a collection of weathered headstones surrounded by an iron fence. But what made her blood run cold was the sight of several freshly dug holes, dark wounds in the earth that seemed to yawn like hungry mouths. Every 10 years, Silas said slowly, on the night of the new moon, our family performs a ritual that has been passed down for generations. We seek counsel from those who came before us. Clara's mouth went dry. Counsel? What do you mean? We wake them, Cordelia said simply. We ask our questions and they provide answers. Guidance for the family's future. Warnings about dangers to come. Knowledge that only the dead possess. The room seemed to spin around Clara. You're talking about desecrating graves, disturbing the dead. We're talking about survival, Silas said firmly. The Ashvale family has thrived for over 2 centuries because we've never made important decisions without consulting those who walked this path before us. Your great-great-grandfather established this tradition after a vision showed him the consequences of ignoring ancestral wisdom. Clara backed toward the door, her heart pounding. This is madness. You're talking about necromancy, We're talking about family responsibility, Thomas interrupted. And this decade, that responsibility falls to you. Me? I haven't been part of this family for 20 years. Marcus turned from the window, his expression grave. Blood doesn't forget, Clara, and according to the family records, you're the designated questioner for this cycle. Your name was chosen before you were even born. Clara felt the walls of the room closing in around her. The familiar house suddenly felt like a trap, and the faces of her relatives looked strange and foreign in the flickering lamplight. I won't be part of this, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Whatever sick tradition you've maintained, I want no part of it. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Silas said, rising from his chair. The ritual must be completed. The ancestors have been disturbed, and they expect their questions. If we don't fulfill our obligation, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a physical presence. Clara thought of the stories she'd heard as a child, whispered tales of family members who had tried to break from tradition, who had met mysterious and terrible ends. What happens if I refuse? She asked. The family exchanged those meaningful glances again, and Clara saw something in their eyes that made her stomach clench with fear. It wasn't just determination, it was desperation. The ritual begins at midnight, Cordelia said. You have until then to prepare yourself. Marcus will explain what's required of you. As if summoned by her words, the sound of digging stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Clara could hear something else. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been wind through the trees, but sounded disturbingly like whispered voices. She looked out the window again and saw that the holes in the cemetery were no longer empty. Dark shapes lay beside each grave, and even from this distance, she could see that they were moving. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill, watching the impossible scene unfold in the cemetery. The shapes beside the graves were definitely moving, not with the fluid motion of the living, but with jerky, unnatural movements that made her skin crawl. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could make out more details that her mind struggled to accept. "Dear God," she whispered, pressing her hand to her mouth. Marcus approached slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. "I know how this looks, Clara. I know how it sounds, but you have to understand, this isn't evil, it's necessity." "Necessity?" Clara spun around to face him, her voice rising. "You've dug up corpses, you've—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence as the full horror of what she was witnessing sank in. "We've awakened our ancestors," Silas said calmly. just as our family has done every decade for the past 200 years. They're not truly alive, Clara. They're consultants. Thomas moved away from the fireplace, his young face pale but determined. The family has faced impossible decisions over the years. Wars, plagues, financial ruin, threats from those who would destroy us. Each time, the wisdom of our ancestors has guided us to safety. Clara backed toward the door again, but found her way blocked by Cordelia, who had moved with surprising speed for a woman of her age. "You can't leave," Cordelia said softly. "Not now. The ritual has begun, and it must be completed. The consequences of abandoning it midway are severe." "What consequences?" Clara demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture she remembered from their childhood when he was nervous. "There was an incident about 60 years ago. Your great-uncle Edmund tried to break the tradition. He was young, idealistic, much like you. He thought the ritual was barbaric. What happened to him?" "He disappeared," Thomas said quietly. 3 days after he refused to participate, they found his body a week later at the bottom of Raven's Gorge. But Clara, he'd been dead for much longer than a week, and he'd been asking questions. Clara felt ice forming in her veins. "What kind of questions?" "The same questions he was supposed to ask during the ritual," Silas explained. "But he was asking them of the wrong dead, the angry dead, the ones who weren't family." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. "You're saying that if I don't participate, I'll die. We're saying that once the ritual begins, it must be completed," Marcus said. "The boundary between life and death becomes permeable. If the proper questions aren't asked, if the proper protocols aren't followed, other things can cross over, things that have been waiting for an opportunity." As if to emphasize his point, a sound drifted through the window, a low moan that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. Clara looked outside again and saw that more shapes had emerged from the graves. Some were clearly recognizable as human forms, while others were less defined. Shadows that moved independently of any light source, writhing masses that might once have been people. "How many are out there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 7 generations of Ashvales," Cordelia replied, "plus a few others. Family friends who earned the right to rest in our cemetery. They all have wisdom to share, but they can only communicate through the designated questioner. And that's me. That's you." Clara sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle in. She was trapped in a house with relatives who had clearly lost their minds, surrounded by animated corpses, and apparently expected to have conversations with the dead. "This is insane," she muttered. "This is absolutely insane." "Sanity is a luxury we can't afford," Silas said. "The Ashvale family has survived wars, economic collapses, and threats that would have destroyed lesser bloodlines. We've thrived because we've never been too proud to ask for help from those who came before us." Marcus knelt beside her chair, his expression earnest. "Clara, I know this is overwhelming, but you have to understand, we didn't choose this burden lightly. The family has records going back to the founding of the tradition. Every major decision, every crisis we've faced, the ancestors have guided us through it." "What kind of decisions?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Thomas pulled a leather-bound journal from a nearby shelf and opened it to a page marked with a black ribbon. "During the War of 1812, they warned us which battles to avoid. During the cholera outbreak of 1832, they told us how to protect the town. When the railroad company tried to force us off our land in 1854, they revealed the legal strategy that saved our property." Clara looked at the journal, seeing page after page of cramped handwriting in various hands. Dates, questions, and what appeared to be responses filled every available space. "And the price for this knowledge?" she asked. The family fell silent. Finally, Cordelia spoke, her voice barely audible. One questioner per decade. They don't always survive the experience. Clara's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? The communication process is taxing, Marcus explained. The questioner serves as a conduit between the living and the dead. Sometimes the strain is too much. Sometimes they don't come back. And you knew this when you summoned me here. We hoped, Silas began, then stopped. We hoped that your education, your time away from the family, might have strengthened you, made you more resilient. Clara stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. You brought me here to die. We brought you here to serve your family, Cordelia said firmly, as every Ashvale has done for generations. Your father understood this when he took you away. He was trying to spare you, but he knew that eventually you would have to fulfill your obligation. My father never told me about any of this. Because he loved you, Thomas said. But love doesn't change blood, Clara. And blood doesn't forget its duties. Outside, the moaning grew louder, and Clara could see more movement in the cemetery. The shapes were becoming more agitated, moving closer to the house. Some of them appeared to be looking directly at the window where she stood. They know you're here, Marcus said. They've been waiting for you. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. How long do I have? The ritual must begin at midnight, Silas replied. That gives you about 4 hours to prepare. Prepare how? Cordelia moved to an ornate wooden cabinet and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. This contains the protocols for communication with the dead, the proper forms of address, the types of questions that can be asked, the protective measures that must be taken. Clara took the book with shaking hands. The leather was old and worn, stained with what looked like dried blood. The pages were filled with diagrams, incantations, and detailed instructions written in multiple hands over what appeared to be many decades. What happens if I make a mistake? She asked. The family exchanged those meaningful glances again, and Clara knew the answer before anyone spoke. Then you join them, Marcus said quietly, and we wait another 10 years for the next questioner. As if summoned by his words, a new sound joined the moaning from outside, a rhythmic tapping against the windows, as if skeletal fingers were drumming against the glass. Clara looked outside and saw that several of the shapes had moved much closer to the house. In the fading daylight, she could make out details that made her stomach lurch. They were definitely human in origin, but time and death had changed them in ways that defied natural law. Some were little more than bones, held together by tattered clothing and sheer will. Others retained more of their flesh, but it hung from their frames in ways that suggested decomposition had been interrupted rather than reversed. And they were all looking at her. They're eager to begin, Cordelia observed. It's been 10 years since they've had the opportunity to speak. They have much to tell us. Clara clutched the book to her chest, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. What if I refuse? What if I just leave? Look outside, Silas said simply. Clara turned to the window and saw that the shapes had formed a rough circle around the house. They weren't moving closer, but they weren't moving away either. They were waiting. They won't let you leave, Marcus explained, not until the ritual is complete. And if you try to run, he gestured toward the journal Thomas still held. Well, you've heard what happened to Edmund. Clara opened the protocol book and began reading the first page. The instructions were detailed and precise, written in a careful hand that suggested the author had been very concerned about accuracy. As she read, she began to understand the true scope of what she was being asked to do. The ritual wasn't just about asking questions, it was about opening herself completely to the dead, allowing them to speak through her, to use her voice and her body as a conduit between worlds. The risks were clearly outlined. Madness, possession, death, or worse, becoming trapped between life and death, neither fully alive nor properly dead. How many questioners have survived? She asked, without looking up from the book. The silence that followed her question was answer enough. As darkness settled over Elders Hollow like a burial shroud, Clara found herself in the mansion's library, surrounded by centuries of Ashvale family records. The protocol book lay open before her, its pages illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. She had spent the last 3 hours studying the intricate details of the ritual, and each page had only deepened her dread. The instructions were precise and unforgiving. The questioner must enter the cemetery at the stroke of midnight, wearing white robes that had been blessed with herbs and oils. She must approach each grave in a specific order, beginning with the oldest and working toward the most recent. Each ancestor required a particular form of address, and the questions must be phrased according to ancient protocols that seemed designed more to protect the questioner than to facilitate communication. Most disturbing of all were the warnings scattered throughout the text. Should the questioner show fear, the dead will sense weakness and may attempt possession. Never turn your back on an awakened ancestor until they have returned to rest. If the questioner's voice changes during communication, the ritual must be abandoned immediately, regardless of consequences. Marcus entered the library carrying a tray of tea and what appeared to be a small vial of dark liquid. His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, and Clara noticed that his hands shook slightly as he set down the tray. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Terrified," Clara replied honestly, "and angry. How could the family keep this from me for so long?" "Your father made us promise," Marcus said. "He hoped that if you stayed away long enough, the obligation might pass to someone else. But blood calls to blood, Clara. The ancestors chose you before you were born." Clara gestured to the protocol book. "According to this, I'm supposed to ask 7 specific questions, 1 to each generation, but it doesn't say what those questions should be." "That's because the questions change based on the family's current needs," Marcus explained. "The elders have been discussing what we need to know most urgently." "And what's that?" Marcus hesitated, then reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded newspaper. The headline made Clara's blood run cold. "Mysterious deaths plague mountain communities. Authorities baffled by string of unexplained fatalities." "It started 3 months ago," Marcus said. "People in the surrounding towns have been dying under strange circumstances. No signs of violence, no apparent cause of death. They just stop living. The authorities are calling it a plague, but the doctors can't find any disease." Clara scanned the article, noting the locations mentioned. All of them were within a day's travel of Elders Hollow. "You think this is connected to our family somehow?" "We think it's connected to the ritual," Marcus said grimly. "This is the first time in the family's history that the designated questioner wasn't present for the awakening. You were supposed to be here 3 months ago, Clara. The ancestors have been waiting and their patience is limited." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. "You're saying that people are dying because I wasn't here to perform this ritual?" "We're saying that the boundary between life and death has been weakened," Marcus corrected. "When the ancestors are awakened but not properly consulted, their energy has to go somewhere. It's been seeping out into the surrounding area, affecting anyone with a weak constitution or a connection to the supernatural." Clara set down the newspaper with shaking hands. "How many people have died?" 47 as of yesterday's count. The weight of those deaths settled on Clara's shoulders like a physical burden. 47 people dead because she had been living her life in Boston, unaware of her family's dark obligations. "The questions we need to ask tonight," Marcus continued, "are about how to stop the deaths and how to strengthen the barriers between worlds. But Clara," he leaned forward, his expression grave, "there's something else. Something we haven't told you." Clara felt her stomach clench. "What now?" "The ancestors aren't the only ones who have been awakened. According to the reports we've been receiving, other cemeteries in the area have been active. Graves disturbed from the inside, sightings of figures that shouldn't exist. We think our ritual has awakened more than just our family. Before Clara could respond, a sound echoed through the house, the deep, resonant toll of a bell. She looked at the grandfather clock in the corner and saw that it was 11:30. "Time to prepare," Marcus said, rising from his chair. He handed her the small vial he had brought with the tea. "Drink this. It will help protect your mind during the communication." Clara examined the dark liquid suspiciously. "What is it?" "A mixture of herbs and other things. It's been used by questioners for generations. It won't eliminate the risks, but it will give you a better chance of maintaining your sanity." Clara uncorked the vial and immediately recoiled from the smell, a mixture of bitter herbs and something metallic that reminded her unpleasantly of blood. How many questioners have survived after drinking this? Marcus's silence was answer enough. Clara downed the liquid in one gulp, fighting the urge to vomit as it burned down her throat. Almost immediately she felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through her body, and the edges of her vision seemed to sharpen while the center became slightly blurred. "The robes are in your room," Marcus said. "Cordelia has prepared them according to the protocols. You have 20 minutes. Clara made her way upstairs to her childhood bedroom, which had been preserved exactly as she had left it 20 years ago. The white robes lay spread across the bed, simple garments made of rough cotton, but she could see symbols embroidered along the hems in thread that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. As she changed clothes, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The herbal mixture had given her skin a pale, almost translucent quality, and her eyes seemed larger and darker than usual. She looked like someone who was already halfway between life and death. The robes fit perfectly, as if they had been made specifically for her. As she tied the cord around her waist, she felt a strange sense of completion, as if she were finally becoming what she had always been meant to be. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara?" It was Thomas's voice. "It's time." She opened the door to find the entire family waiting in the hallway, all dressed in dark clothing that made them look like mourners at a funeral. In Silas's hands was an ornate lantern that cast an eerie blue light. "The ancestors are growing restless," Cordelia said. "We can hear them calling from the cemetery." As if to confirm her words, a sound drifted through the house, voices raised in what might have been song, but the melody was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a harmony that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her bones. "Remember," Silas said, handing her the lantern, "approach each grave in order of age. Address each ancestor by their full name and title. Ask your questions clearly and listen carefully to the responses. And whatever you do, don't let them touch you until the ritual is complete." Clara took the lantern, surprised by its weight. The blue light seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she could feel warmth radiating from the metal handle. "What happens if something goes wrong?" she asked. "Then we'll know within the hour," Marcus replied grimly. "If you're not back by dawn, we'll assume the worst." Clara looked at each of her family members in turn, seeing fear and hope warring in their expressions. Despite everything they had put her through, she realized that they were as trapped by this tradition as she was. They were all prisoners of their bloodline, bound by obligations that stretched back through centuries. "If I don't survive this," she said, "promise me you'll find a way to end it, find a way to break the cycle." "Clara," Marcus began. "Promise me." Silas stepped forward, his gray eyes reflecting the lantern's blue light. "If you don't survive, there may not be anyone left to make such promises. The barriers are weakening, Clara. If this ritual fails, if the ancestors aren't properly consulted and returned to rest, the consequences will extend far beyond our family." The grandfather clock began to chime midnight, its deep tones echoing through the house like a funeral dirge. With each chime, Clara felt something shifting in the air around her, as if reality itself was becoming more fluid. "It's time," Cordelia whispered. Clara walked to the back door, her family following in silent procession. As she stepped outside into the cold night air, the singing from the cemetery grew louder, and she could see lights moving among the headstones. Not the warm yellow glow of lanterns, but the same cold blue light that emanated from her own lamp. The path to the cemetery stretched before her like a gauntlet, and at its end she could see figures waiting among the graves. They stood perfectly still, but she could feel their attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, Clara began walking toward the cemetery gates, each step carrying her further from the world of the living and closer to something that defied all natural law. Behind her, she could hear her family whispering prayers or incantations, but their voices seemed to be coming from very far away. As she reached the cemetery gates, they swung open without her touching them, revealing the full scope of what awaited her inside. 7 figures stood among the headstones, each positioned beside their own grave. They were more solid than they had appeared from the house, but there was something fundamentally wrong about their presence. They cast no shadows despite the lantern light, and the air around them seemed to shimmer like heat waves. The nearest figure, standing beside the oldest headstone, turned toward her. Clara could see that it had once been a man, tall and dignified, wearing clothes from a much earlier era. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, child of our blood," he said. "We have been waiting for you." Clara's legs trembled as she approached the first grave, the blue lantern casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of its light. The figure standing beside the oldest headstone was clearer now, a tall man in colonial-era clothing, his face gaunt but unmistakably bearing the sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes that marked him as an Ashvale. The nameplate on the weathered stone read, "Ezekiel Ashvale, 1698 to 1762, founder of the line." "Ezekiel Ashvale," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper as she followed the protocol book's instructions. "First of our blood, keeper of the original covenant, I come seeking wisdom in our hour of need." The figure's eyes fixed on hers, and Clara felt a chill that went deeper than the autumn night. When Ezekiel spoke, his voice seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. "The barriers weaken, child. The covenant your generation has neglected threatens to unravel completely. Ask your question, but know that knowledge comes with a price." Clara steadied herself, remembering the newspaper article and the 47 deaths. The people in the surrounding towns are dying mysteriously. Is this connected to our family's ritual? And how can we stop it? Ezekiel's form flickered like a candle flame in the wind. The deaths are but the beginning. When the ritual is delayed, when the proper channels are not maintained, the energy of the awakened dead seeks other outlets. It flows into the weak, the sensitive, those whose connection to life is already tenuous. But how do we stop it? The ritual must be completed as intended, but more than that, the covenant must be renewed. The original pact that binds our family to this duty has been weakened by generations of reluctant participants. It requires willing sacrifice to restore its strength. Clara felt ice forming in her veins. What kind of sacrifice? But Ezekiel was already fading, his form becoming translucent. Ask the others, they will tell you what I cannot. Following the prescribed path, Clara moved to the second grave. The headstone read, Jeremiah Ashvale, 1725-1798, Keeper of Secrets. The figure waiting here was younger than Ezekiel, dressed in the fashion of the Revolutionary War era. His uniform bore stains that looked suspiciously like old blood. Jeremiah Ashvale, Clara intoned. Second of our line, guardian of hidden knowledge, I seek your counsel. Jeremiah's eyes glowed with an inner light that made Clara's skin crawl. The girl asks about death, but she does not understand life. The covenant was forged in blood, child. It can only be renewed in blood. Whose blood? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. The questioner's blood has always been the price, but this time the debt is greater. The delay has cost 47 lives. The balance must be restored. Clara's hands shook as she held the lantern. Are you saying I have to die to fix this? I am saying that death is not the end, merely a transformation. Your father understood this when he tried to break the cycle. He thought love could overcome blood, but blood remembers what love forgets. Before Clara could ask what he meant, Jeremiah gestured toward the third grave. Ask Constance about the price of defiance. She learned it well. The third headstone bore the name Constance Ashvale, 1751-1823, the defiant daughter. The figure here was a woman in early 19th century dress, but her appearance was more disturbing than the others. Her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and dark stains covered the front of her gown. Constance Ashvale, Clara said, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. Third of our line, I seek to understand the consequences of breaking our family's obligations. Constance's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Consequences? Oh, child, you have no idea what consequences await those who try to escape their destiny. I thought I could marry outside the family, take my children far from this cursed place. I thought love could conquer blood. What happened? The ancestors came for me, not in dreams or visions, but in flesh and bone. They dragged me back to this cemetery and showed me what happens to those who abandon their duties. My children died of wasting sickness within a month. My husband went mad and threw himself from a cliff. And I learned that some bonds cannot be broken by distance or desire. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. There has to be another way. There is, Constance said, her twisted head tilting at an impossible angle. But it requires understanding what the covenant truly is. Ask Mordecai. He was there when it was made. The fourth grave belonged to Mordecai Ashvale, 1778-1845, witness to the pact. The figure here was different from the others, older, more solid, and radiating an aura of ancient power that made the air around him shimmer. Mordecai Ashvale, Clara said, fourth of our line, witness to the original covenant, I seek to understand the true nature of our family's burden. Mordecai's eyes were like black holes in his gaunt face. The covenant was not made with death, child. It was made with something far older, far more powerful, the entity that dwells beneath this cemetery, the thing that feeds on the boundary between life and death. Clara's blood turned to ice. What entity? It has many names, but we have always called it the Keeper. It maintains the balance between worlds, but it requires regular feeding. Our family agreed to provide that feeding in exchange for protection and prosperity. Feeding on what? Life force. The energy that separates the living from the dead. Usually, the ritual provides enough energy to satisfy it. The questioner serves as a conduit, allowing it to taste life without fully consuming it. But when the ritual is delayed, it feeds on whoever it can reach, Clara finished, understanding flooding through her. Precisely. And now it is hungry. Very hungry. The 47 deaths are just the beginning. If it is not properly fed soon, it will break free of the constraints that bind it to this cemetery. Clara looked around at the other waiting figures, understanding dawning on her with horrible clarity. And if it breaks free, then death will spread like a plague across the land. It will feed until it is satisfied, and its appetite has grown considerably over the past 3 months. The fifth grave held Abigail Ashvale, 1802-1867, the reluctant bride. Her figure appeared younger than the others, wearing a wedding dress that had yellowed with age, but her eyes held a wisdom that spoke of terrible experience. Abigail Ashvale, Clara said, her voice now steady with grim determination. Fifth of our line, I seek to know if there is any way to break the covenant without destroying everything. Abigail's voice was soft, but carried an undertone of infinite sadness. I spent 40 years searching for that answer, child. I consulted scholars, priests, practitioners of the old ways. There is a way, but the price is higher than simple death. Tell me, the keeper can be satisfied with a willing sacrifice, someone who chooses to cross the boundary permanently to become its eternal servant. But it must be someone of Ashvale blood, and they must make the choice freely, with full knowledge of what they're accepting. Clara felt her heart pounding. What does that mean exactly? It means becoming like us, but worse. Trapped between life and death, conscious but not truly alive, serving the keeper's will for eternity. The questioner would become the guardian of the cemetery, ensuring that the keeper never grows hungry enough to break free again. The sixth grave belonged to Thaddeus Ashvale, 1829-1889, the scholar. His figure was bent with age, clutching what appeared to be an ancient tome. "Thaddeus Ashvale," Clara said, "sixth of our line, keeper of knowledge. I seek to understand the full scope of what I must choose." Thaddeus looked up from his book, his eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom. "The choice before you is simple in its horror, child. Continue the cycle, perform the ritual, ask the questions, and hope you survive to see another decade, or end it forever by taking Abigail's path." "But if I become the keeper's eternal servant, what happens to the family? What happens to the ritual? The ritual ends. The covenant is fulfilled in a different way. The family is freed from its obligations, but they lose the protection and guidance that has kept them prosperous for centuries. They become ordinary." Clara looked toward the seventh and final grave, where a figure she recognized was waiting. The headstone read, "Eleanor Ashvale, 1834-1887. Her grandmother buried just that morning." "Grandmother," Clara whispered, approaching the final grave. Eleanor's figure was the most solid of all, her appearance exactly as Clara remembered from childhood visits, but her eyes held a depth of knowledge that spoke of recent revelations. "My dear child," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the warmth Clara remembered, "I had hoped you would never have to face this choice. But the time for hoping has passed. Grandmother, what should I do? How can I save everyone?" Eleanor's expression was infinitely sad. "The deaths in the surrounding towns, they're not random, Clara. The keeper is testing its reach, seeing how far its influence can extend. If the ritual fails tonight, if you cannot provide what it needs, it will break free of this cemetery and spread across the entire region. But if I become its eternal servant, then you save thousands of lives, but condemn yourself to an existence worse than death. You would be conscious, aware, but trapped in service to something that feeds on the boundary between life and death. You would watch over this cemetery for eternity, ensuring that the keeper remains satisfied and contained." Clara felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her. Around her, the seven ancestors waited in silence, their forms beginning to flicker as the night wore on. "There's something else," Eleanor continued, "something the others haven't told you. The keeper grows stronger with each feeding. If you choose to continue the ritual as it has always been done, the next questioner will face an even hungrier entity, and the one after that will face something even worse. Eventually, no questioner will be strong enough to survive the communication. So the cycle has to end eventually anyway." "Yes. The question is whether it ends with you making a conscious choice, or with some future questioner being consumed entirely, leaving the keeper free to rampage across the world." Clara looked back toward the house, where she could see her family waiting anxiously by the windows. Marcus, Thomas, Silas, Cordelia, all of them trapped by a covenant made centuries before their birth, all of them dependent on her decision. "If I choose to become the keeper's servant," she asked, "what happens to them? They live normal lives. They lose the supernatural protection that has kept the family prosperous, but they also lose the burden of the ritual. Their children will never have to stand where you stand now." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. When she opened them again, she saw that the ancestors were beginning to fade, their forms becoming translucent as dawn approached. "I need to know," she said urgently. "If I make this sacrifice, will it truly end? Will the Keeper be satisfied forever?" Eleanor's form was already becoming difficult to see. "Nothing is forever, child, but it will be satisfied for centuries to come. Long enough for the world to change, for new solutions to be found. You would be buying time for future generations to find a better way." As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, the ancestors began to disappear one by one. But their voices lingered in the air, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Choose quickly," they said in unison. "The Keeper grows impatient. Choose, or the choice will be made for you." Clara stood alone in the cemetery as the sun rose, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear her family calling her name, their voices filled with worry and hope. But beneath her feet, she could feel something else stirring, something ancient and hungry, waiting to see what she would decide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Clara stood among the fading remnants of her ancestors' presence. The blue lantern in her hands had dimmed to barely a flicker, and she could feel the weight of the Keeper's attention pressing down on her like a physical force. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and she knew that something vast and ancient was stirring in the depths below. From the house, she could hear her family calling her name, their voices growing more urgent as the minutes passed. But Clara remained motionless, caught between two impossible choices, each carrying consequences that would echo through generations. As she stood there, the earth around Eleanor's grave began to shift and crack. A low rumble emanated from somewhere deep underground, and Clara realized that her time for deliberation was running out. The Keeper was growing impatient. "Clara!" Marcus's voice carried across the cemetery as he ran toward her, followed by the rest of the family. "What's happening? The ritual should be complete by now." She turned to face them, and they stopped short at the sight of her expression. The herbal mixture had worn off, but something else had taken its place, a clarity that came from standing at the crossroads between life and death. "The ancestors have given me their counsel," she said, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "But the choice they've left me with is not one any person should have to make." Silas stepped forward, his face pale in the morning light. "What choice? What did they tell you?" Clara looked at each of them in turn, Marcus with his premature grey hair and worried eyes, Thomas still young enough to believe in simple solutions, Cordelia sharp and brittle as winter ice, and Silas carrying the weight of family leadership like a burden he'd never wanted. "They told me the truth about our covenant," she said, "about the entity that lives beneath this cemetery, about the price it demands, and about what will happen if that price isn't paid." The ground shuddered again, more violently this time, and several headstones tilted at dangerous angles. In the distance, Clara could hear sounds that didn't belong to the natural world, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and a low humming that made her teeth ache. "The 47 deaths are just the beginning," she continued. "The Keeper, the thing our family has been feeding for centuries, is breaking free of the constraints that bind it to this place. If I don't give it what it wants, it will spread across the entire region, consuming life force until it's satisfied." Thomas stepped forward, his young face earnest. "Then give it what it wants. Perform the ritual as it's always been done." Clara shook her head. "It's not that simple anymore. The delay has made it hungrier, more powerful. The traditional ritual won't be enough. It wants a permanent sacrifice, someone to serve as its eternal guardian, ensuring it never grows hungry enough to break free again." The family exchanged horrified glances. Cordelia was the first to speak, her voice sharp with fear. "You're talking about dying for this thing." "Worse than dying," Clara corrected. "I would become something like our ancestors, but trapped in service to the Keeper forever, conscious, aware, but no longer truly alive." And Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip desperate. There has to be another way. There's always another way. Is there? Clara asked, pulling free of his grasp. How many more decades of this ritual? How many more questioners consumed by an entity that grows stronger with each feeding? How many more families torn apart by obligations they never chose? The humming grew louder, and Clara could see cracks spreading across the cemetery ground like a spider web. From the deepest fissures, a pale light began to emanate. Not the blue glow of the lantern, but something sickly and wrong that made her eyes water to look at directly. "It's coming," she said, backing away from the spreading cracks. "The Keeper is breaking free." As if summoned by her words, something began to emerge from the largest crack near the center of the cemetery. At first it was just a shadow, a darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than cast it. But as it rose higher, Clara could see that it had a form of sorts, though her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The Keeper was enormous, easily 20 feet tall, with a shape that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. It had what might have been a face, but the features were constantly changing, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes something that belonged to no earthly creature. Its eyes, when they were visible, burned with the pale light that was seeping from the cracks in the ground. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of wind through a graveyard, carrying the whispers of every soul it had ever consumed. "The Covenant has been neglected," it said, its attention fixed on Clara. "The debt grows heavy. Payment is required." Clara's family huddled together behind her, their faces white with terror. But Clara herself felt strangely calm as she faced the entity that had controlled her family's destiny for centuries. "I know what you want," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "but I want something in return." The Keeper's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "You would bargain with me, child of Ashvale blood?" "I would negotiate the terms of my service," Clara replied. "If I'm to become your eternal guardian, I want guarantees." "Speak your terms." Clara took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone she cared about. "First, my family is released from all obligations to you. The Covenant ends with me. They and their descendants will never again be bound to serve you." "Acceptable. What else?" "Second, you will never again extend your influence beyond this cemetery. You will remain contained here, feeding only on what I provide, never again reaching out to consume the innocent." The Keeper's form darkened, and Clara could feel its displeasure like a physical weight. "That is limiting." "That's the point," Clara said firmly. "If you want a willing servant, those are my terms. And if I refuse?" Clara gestured toward her family, who were watching the exchange with a mixture of terror and admiration. "Then you get nothing. I'll die before I serve you unwillingly, and my family will find a way to destroy this place, even if it costs them their lives." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. The Keeper's form shifted and writhed as it considered her offer, and Clara could feel the weight of its ancient intelligence pressing against her mind. Finally, it spoke. "Your terms are acceptable, but know this, child. The service you offer is eternal. There will be no rest, no peace, no escape. You will guard this place until the stars burn out and the world ends." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but her voice remained steady. "I understand." She turned to face her family one last time, memorizing their faces. Marcus was crying openly, and even Silas looked shaken. Thomas appeared to be in shock, while Cordelia's sharp features had softened with something that might have been respect. "I need you to promise me something," Clara said to them. "Promise me you'll use the freedom I'm buying you, live normal lives, have children who will never know the weight of supernatural obligation. Make my sacrifice mean something." Marcus stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Clara, please. There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said gently. "And even if there was, this is the right choice. The cycle ends here. The covenant dies with me." She turned back to the keeper, which had grown even larger and more solid as their negotiation progressed. "I'm ready." "Then come," it said, extending what might have been a hand. "Cross the threshold willingly and become what you were always meant to be." Clara took a step forward, then stopped. "One more thing. I want to know your true name. If I'm to serve you for eternity, I should know what to call you." The keeper's form rippled again, and when it spoke, its voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "I am Malphus, the keeper of thresholds, guardian of the boundary between life and death. I have existed since the first human drew breath, and I will exist until the last one expires. Then I, Clara Ashvale, last questioner of my line, offer myself willingly to your service, Malphus." She reached out and grasped the entity's outstretched appendage. The moment their flesh touched, Clara felt a shock of cold that went deeper than her bones, deeper than her soul. The world around her began to change, colors fading to shades of gray and black, sounds becoming muffled and distant. But even as she felt her humanity slipping away, she also felt a sense of completion. The weight of generations of obligation was lifting from her family's shoulders, and the deaths that had plagued the surrounding towns would stop. She was buying peace with her sacrifice, purchasing freedom with her eternal servitude. As the transformation took hold, Clara's last coherent thought was of her family, standing safely outside the cemetery gates, finally free to live their own lives. She had broken the cycle that had bound the Ashvales for centuries, and though the price was higher than anyone should have to pay, she knew it was worth it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light over the cemetery where Clara Ashvale had made her final choice. Her family stood watching as the cracks in the ground sealed themselves and the unnatural lights faded away. Where Clara had stood, a new headstone appeared bearing a simple inscription: Clara Ashvale, 1862-1887, the last questioner, guardian eternal. And in the depths below, Malphus settled back into its ancient slumber, satisfied at last with its new servant. The covenant was fulfilled, the cycle was broken, and the Ashvale family was finally free. But freedom, as Clara had learned, always comes with a price. And some prices are paid not just once, but for all eternity. In the years that followed, the people of Elders Hollow would speak in whispers of the young woman who had saved them all, and travelers passing through the cemetery at night would sometimes catch glimpses of a figure in white robes standing guard among the headstones, ensuring that some doors between worlds remained forever closed. The Ashvale family kept their promise. They lived normal lives, had children who grew up free of supernatural obligation, and slowly the dark legacy of their bloodline faded into legend. But they never forgot Clara's sacrifice, and every year, on the anniversary of that terrible night, they would visit her grave and leave flowers, a small tribute to the woman who had chosen eternal servitude so that others might live free. And deep beneath the cemetery, in the space between life and death, Clara Ashvale stood her eternal watch, guardian of a threshold that must never again be crossed, keeper of a bargain that had saved the world from an ancient hunger. The cycle was broken, the covenant was ended, and the price was paid.